My mother stood up in front of 200 people, tapped her glass with a spoon, and said, "And this is my daughter, Claire." The family disappointment. Then she smiled, turned to the waiter, and pointed to a small table pushed against the kitchen door. "She'll sit there." Nobody laughed. Nobody defended me. My father looked at his plate. My brother looked at his phone. And I picked up my purse, walked to that little table by the swinging kitchen door, and sat down like it was the most natural thing in the world. What none of them knew was that in 3 weeks, I was going to own the roof over their heads. Literally. And I was going to do it without raising my voice even once. My name is Claire Whitfield. I am 44 years old. I am an architect. And for most of my life, I believed my mother when she told me I was the disappointment in our family. I want to tell you how that night at the kitchen door ended. But first, I need to tell you how it began, because the real story did not start that evening. It started 22 years earlier, in a hospital hallway, when I was the one who held my grandfather's hand while he cried, and nobody in my family ever knew. Our family name is not famous the way movie stars are famous. But if you have ever lived in the northeast of this country, you may have heard of Whitfield Development. My grandfather, Arthur Whitfield, built it from nothing. He started as a carpenter's apprentice in 1958, and by the time I was born, the company had put up office buildings, apartment complexes, and one beautiful old theater downtown that everybody in our city loved. My grandfather used to say, "A building isn't finished when the last brick is laid. It's finished when a family calls it home." I loved my grandfather more than anyone else in the world. He was the only person in my family who ever really saw me. My mother, Eleanor, was Arthur's daughter-in-law, married to my father, Robert, who was Arthur's only son. My mother came from a family with old money and older opinions. She believed in appearances above almost everything else. And from the time I was a little girl, I understood that in my mother's eyes, there were two kinds of children. There were children who made a family look good, and there were children who did not. My older brother, Daniel, made the family look good. He was handsome, easy to talk to, good at sports, and he loved being the center of attention. My mother adored him the way some mothers adore their firstborn sons, completely and without question. I was quiet. I liked to read. I liked to draw buildings in the margins of my school notebooks instead of listening to the teacher. I asked a lot of questions, and I noticed things other people didn't notice, like which chair in a room was slightly uneven, or which wall in our house was load-bearing and which one was not. My mother found this strange. She used to say, "Claire, why can't you just be normal?" When I was 12, I designed a treehouse for the backyard, drew the whole plan out on paper, measured the yard myself, and showed it to my grandfather. He looked at that drawing for a long time, and then he looked at me, and he said, "Claire, you have the eye. Your great-grandfather had the eye too. Not everybody has it." That was the first time in my life someone told me I was good at something. I kept that drawing my whole life. I still have it. But my mother did not see the eye. She saw a daughter who didn't fit into the pretty pictures she wanted for her family. And Daniel, sensing early on which way the wind blew in our house, learned to use that against me. If I got a good grade, he would tell our mother I'd cheated. If I won a school art contest, he would say I only won because the teacher felt sorry for me. My mother believed him every single time, because believing him was easier than looking closely at either of us. By the time I was 16, I had stopped bringing home report cards to show my parents. I only showed my grandfather. When I turned 18, I told my family I wanted to study architecture. My mother laughed, actually laughed, right there at the dinner table and said, "Architecture? Claire, sweetheart, you can barely keep your room clean. You think you're going to design buildings?" My father said nothing, because my father never said anything that might upset my mother. Daniel, who was 20 and already working at the family company in a job my grandfather had basically created for him, said, "Maybe try something easier. Like interior decorating or something." I went anyway. I worked 2 jobs through college. My grandfather quietly paid for the semesters I couldn't cover, and he made me promise never to tell my mother, because he said she would find a way to make it about something else. He was right. He usually was. I graduated with honors. Nobody from my family came to the ceremony except my grandfather, who sat in the front row in his good suit and cried when they called my name. After college, I did not go to work for Whitfield Development, even though my grandfather offered. I wanted to build something with my own name on it, not stand in Daniel's shadow at a company where my mother would still find ways to remind everyone I was the daughter who settled for a career instead of a husband and children the way a proper Whitfield woman should. I took a job at a small architecture firm 2 states away. I worked hard. I was good at it. Within 8 years, I had my own license and my own small firm, which I named Fieldstone Architecture, after the stone my grandfather always used to say was honest material, the kind that doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. I did not use the Whitfield name for my company. That was not an accident. Over the years, I came home for holidays less and less. Every visit followed the same pattern. My mother would ask about my love life, sigh when I had no exciting news, and then spend the rest of the meal talking about Daniel's promotions, Daniel's new house, Daniel's wife Melissa, and their 2 children, who my mother called the only grandchildren who matter, right in front of me, as if I were invisible, or as if being unmarried and childless made me something less than a daughter. Daniel, for his part, had risen at Whitfield Development mostly on the strength of our family name rather than actual skill. My grandfather told me privately more than once that he worried about the direction Daniel was taking the company. Daniel wanted to expand fast, take on debt, build flashy properties that looked good in photographs, but were built with shortcuts my grandfather never would have approved of. My grandfather was getting older, and he was tired, and slowly, piece by piece, he began stepping back from daily control, leaving more and more decisions to Daniel and my father, who mostly just went along with whatever Daniel wanted. I watched this from a distance, worried, but not involved. Whitfield Development was not my company. I had left that world a long time ago. Or so I thought. Here is the part of the story I need to explain carefully, because it matters for everything that happens later. 6 years ago, my grandfather called me late one night. He sounded different, quieter than usual. He told me the company was carrying more debt than he liked, that Daniel had pushed through a large loan against one of their biggest properties, a historic building downtown called the Everly, the same theater my grandfather had restored decades earlier and always considered his proudest achievement. My grandfather was afraid that if things went wrong, the family could lose the Everly entirely to the bank that held the loan. He asked me a question that surprised me. He asked if I would be willing, quietly, without telling anyone in the family, to buy a portion of that debt myself, through my own company, using a business structure that would keep my name out of it. He said, "Claire, I trust you more than I trust anyone else in this family to protect what I built. I am not asking you to save your brother. I am asking you to save the Everly, in case one day it needs saving, and nobody else will be in a position to do it." I said yes. Over the following years, quietly and legally, through a holding company I set up called Stonebridge Partners, which had no obvious connection to my name, I purchased a growing share of Whitfield Development's outstanding debt and, eventually, a meaningful minority stake in the company itself. Whenever shares became available through private buybacks Daniel didn't fully understand the terms of. I did this the way I do everything, carefully, patiently, with contracts reviewed by lawyers, with nothing hidden that wasn't legally allowed to be hidden. I was not scheming. I was not planning revenge. I genuinely believed, at the time, that I was simply protecting my grandfather's legacy in case his fears about Daniel's decisions came true. My grandfather passed away 2 years ago. I gave the eulogy, because he asked me to, in writing in his will, which surprised absolutely everyone in my family except me. In that same will, he left me his original hand-drawn blueprints for the Everly Theater, a small collection of his tools, and a letter that I still keep in the top drawer of my desk. The letter said, "Claire, you were never the disappointment. You were simply the one who saw clearly, in a family that preferred not to look too closely at itself. Whatever happens with the company, protect the Everly. It was always meant for people, not for pride." He left the majority of his personal shares in Whitfield Development to my father, who then, over the following 2 years, transferred most of his authority, though not all of his shares, to Daniel, who became CEO. I tell you all of this so you understand that by the time I walked into that ballroom for Whitfield Development's 50th anniversary gala 3 weeks ago, I was not simply Claire, the family disappointment. I was also, quietly, through Stonebridge Partners, the second largest shareholder in the company, holding the majority position specifically over the loan attached to the Everly Theater. Nobody in my family knew this. Not my mother. Not my father. Not Daniel. Now, back to that night. The gala was held at the Everly itself, fully restored, lights glowing gold across its old brick front, banners announcing 50 years of Whitfield Development hanging above the entrance. My mother had planned the event for over a year. She wanted it to be perfect, a shining night to prove to the whole city that our family was exactly the kind of family she had always pretended we were. I almost didn't go. But it was my grandfather's building, and some part of me needed to stand inside it one more time, surrounded by people, the way he would have wanted. I wore a simple navy dress. I did my own hair. I walked in alone, the way I walked into most things. My mother spotted me near the entrance, and I watched her face shift, that quick flash of irritation she never quite learned to hide from me, even after 44 years. She air-kissed my cheek, looked me up and down, and said, "Oh, Claire. You came. I wasn't sure you would." Then, before I could even answer, she turned to a group of women beside her, business partners' wives, city council members, people my mother cared very much about impressing, and she said the words that changed everything. "Everyone, this is my daughter, Claire. The family disappointment." She said it lightly, like a joke, like something charming, the way you'd introduce someone as the family clown or the shopaholic. But everyone standing there understood exactly what she meant and exactly how much truth was underneath the joke. A few people laughed uncomfortably. One woman gave me a pitying smile. I felt my face go hot and then, strangely, calm. My mother continued, waving toward a small round table pressed right against the kitchen's swinging service door, where the catering staff pushed in and out with trays. "You'll sit there, sweetheart." We seated family and important guests up front, and, well, there wasn't quite enough room at the main tables. Daniel and his family were seated at the head table, directly beside my parents, close to the small stage where speeches would be given. My seat did not even have a name card. Someone had simply scribbled Claire on a folded piece of paper. I looked at my father. He gave me a small, apologetic shrug, the same shrug he had been giving me my entire life instead of ever actually standing up for me. I looked at Daniel, who was already engaged in conversation with a city councilman, not even glancing my way. And I want to tell you honestly, in that moment, something in me that had been holding on for over 40 years, quietly hoping that one day my mother would finally see me, simply let go. Not with anger. Not with tears. It felt more like release, the way you feel when you finally put down something heavy you've been carrying so long you forgot it was even heavy. I walked to the little table by the kitchen door and I sat down. For most of the night, I sat there alone, watching servers rush past me with trays of food, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses from the tables where my family sat, close enough to see but far enough that I might as well have not been in the room at all. Around 9 o'clock, the speeches began. My father spoke briefly, thanking guests for coming, honoring his father's memory. Then my mother took the microphone and spoke for nearly 15 minutes about the Whitfield family legacy, about strength, about unity, about how proud my grandfather would be tonight, watching his family carry his dream into the next 50 years. Not once did she mention me. When she gestured toward her children, she gestured only toward Daniel, standing beside his wife and 2 kids, all 4 of them glowing under the stage lights. Then Daniel took the microphone, thanked our mother, thanked the board, and announced that under his leadership, Whitfield Development was preparing to break ground on its most ambitious project yet, a full renovation and expansion of the Everly Theater itself, transforming half the historic building into luxury condominiums. He called it modernizing our grandfather's dream for a new generation. The room applauded warmly. I did not. Because I knew something the room did not know. I knew that any major renovation or change of use to the Everly required, according to the very specific terms buried inside the loan agreement I had quietly purchased 2 years earlier, the written approval of whoever held the majority position on that particular debt. Daniel, in his rush to modernize and impress, had apparently never bothered to have his own lawyers review those older loan documents carefully, or perhaps he had, and simply assumed, like everyone else, that the mysterious investor behind Stonebridge Partners was some anonymous business entity with no personal stake in the outcome. He had no idea that mysterious investor was the sister he had just publicly ignored, sitting by the kitchen door. I want to be honest with you. I did not plan, that night, to reveal anything. I had actually planned to quietly let my lawyers handle the approval process in the coming weeks, the way I had handled everything else, without drama, without confrontation. I never wanted to embarrass my family. I only ever wanted to protect what my grandfather built. But then Daniel said something that changed my mind. Standing at that podium, riding high on the applause, he added, almost as an afterthought, and I want to give a special thank you to my sister, Claire, for reminding all of us over the years what happens when you don't fully commit to the family business. Some of us built this company. Others just watched from a distance. The room laughed, not cruelly, but lightly, the way people laugh at a joke they don't fully understand, but sense is expected of them. My mother, beside him, smiled proudly. I sat very still. I did not cry. I did not run out of the room. I thought about my grandfather's letter, folded in my desk drawer at home. I thought about the words, "You were never the disappointment." And I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I did not storm the stage. I simply walked, calmly, from my little table by the kitchen door, up toward the front of the room, while 200 people slowly turned to watch me, murmuring, confused. My mother's smile faltered. Daniel's expression shifted from confusion to mild irritation, as if I were somehow ruining his moment simply by moving. I stopped a few feet from the stage and I asked, politely, if I could borrow the microphone for just a moment. Daniel, caught off guard in front of a room full of guests and city officials, could hardly refuse without looking rude. He handed it over, forcing a smile. I did not shout. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I simply said, "Thank you, Daniel, for that generous introduction. I want to add something, if that's all right. 50 years ago, our grandfather built this theater by hand, quite literally, alongside 3 other carpenters, because he believed a city needed places where families could gather, not just places where money could grow. He restored this exact building in 1988, after a fire nearly destroyed it, using his own savings, because the insurance company at the time refused to pay for what they called unnecessary historical details. He never forgot how it felt to almost lose something he loved because someone else decided it wasn't worth saving." The room had gone quiet. My mother's face had gone pale. I continued. 2 years ago, before he passed, my grandfather asked me to help protect this building, specifically, in case anyone in this family ever considered changing it in a way he wouldn't have approved of. I did that quietly, through a company called Stonebridge Partners, because he asked me to keep it private, and because I have never needed public recognition to do the right thing. I paused, and I looked directly at my mother for the first time that night. I only mention it now because my brother just announced plans to convert half of this building into luxury condominiums. I'm sorry to say, that plan cannot move forward without written approval from the majority holder on the loan secured against this property. That approval belongs to Stonebridge Partners, which belongs to me. You could have heard a pin drop in that ballroom. Daniel's face went through several emotions very quickly, disbelief, confusion, and then something close to panic, as the weight of what I'd said began to register with him, and with the lawyers and board members scattered throughout the room, several of whom were already pulling out their phones, presumably to check the very documents Daniel had apparently never fully read. My mother stood frozen beside the stage, staring at me like she was seeing me, really seeing me, for the very first time in my entire life. I did not gloat. I did not smile in triumph. I simply handed the microphone back to Daniel, and I said, quietly, so that only those closest to the stage could hear, I'm not going to block the renovation to punish anyone. I'm going to block it because it isn't what he wanted. If you'd like to talk about a version of this project that honors what Grandpa actually built, I'm happy to sit down with you. My office is open Monday. Then I turned and walked back to my little table by the kitchen door, sat down, and finished the rest of my dinner alone, while the entire room buzzed with whispered conversations around me. That was the twist nobody in my family saw coming, not because I had been hiding some dramatic secret plan all along, but because they had spent so many years assuming I was too quiet, too unimportant, too much of a disappointment to ever matter to the future of that company. They never once considered that the daughter they seated by the kitchen door might already be sitting, legally and quietly, closer to the center of everything than any of them realized. In the weeks that followed, everything in my family shifted, though not in the dramatic, explosive way you might expect from a movie. There was no shouting match, no lawsuit filed in anger, no scene where I stood over my mother delivering some triumphant speech about all the years of pain she caused me. That is not who I am, and it never was. Instead, what happened was quieter, and in many ways, far more satisfying. Daniel called me 3 days after the gala, his voice tight and formal, asking to schedule a meeting. When we sat down together in my office, surrounded by the drafting tables and building models he had never once shown any interest in visiting during all the years I'd had my own firm, he tried, at first, to negotiate, then to charm, then, when neither worked, to quietly threaten legal action, claiming I had somehow acted improperly. His lawyers reviewed the loan documents within a week and confirmed, in writing, that everything I had done was completely legal, transparent, and binding. I did not use that leverage to take over the company, or to push Daniel out of his position, or to humiliate my family publicly any further than that one unavoidable moment at the gala. Instead, I proposed something my grandfather would have approved of. I offered to approve a scaled-back renovation of the Everly, one that preserved the original theater completely and added modern space only to the unused rear section of the building, keeping the front, the stage, the seats, and the facade my grandfather rebuilt with his own hands exactly as they were. I offered my own architecture firm's services to design it, at no additional cost to the company, on one condition: that a plaque be placed permanently in the lobby, honoring Arthur Whitfield, and that the building never be sold out of family ownership as long as any of his direct descendants were living. Daniel agreed, mostly because he had no real choice, but also, I believe, because some small part of him understood, for the first time, that I had never been trying to hurt him. I had only ever been trying to protect what actually mattered. My mother took longer to come around. For weeks after the gala, she barely spoke to me, embarrassed, I think, more by the fact that people now saw her differently than by any genuine reflection on how she had treated me for over 40 years. But 6 months later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, she came to my apartment unannounced, something she had never done before in my entire life. She stood in my doorway, looking smaller than I remembered, and she said, "I didn't know you were any of that. The company. The building. Any of it." I told her that was exactly the point. I had never needed her to know, because I had never done any of it for recognition. I had done it because someone in our family needed to actually protect what mattered, instead of just talking about legacy at fancy dinners. She was quiet for a long time. And then she said something I never expected to hear from her. She said, "I think I spent so many years worried about how our family looked to other people that I forgot to actually look at you." It was not a full apology. My mother has never been a woman capable of that kind of full, unguarded honesty. But it was something. It was more than I had received from her in over 40 years, and for now, it was enough. The Everly reopened 18 months later, fully restored, exactly the way my grandfather would have wanted it. At the reopening ceremony, there was no seating chart with my name shoved by a kitchen door. I was seated at the front, beside my parents, beside Daniel and his family, as the plaque honoring Arthur Whitfield was unveiled in the lobby. Beneath his name, at my request, They added the words he once said to me when I was 12 years old, standing in our backyard with a treehouse drawing in my hands. A building isn't finished when the last brick is laid. It's finished when a family calls it home. I still run my own firm. I still keep his letter in my top desk drawer. And every now and then, when I walk past the Everly at night, lit up gold the way it was the evening my mother introduced me as the family disappointment, I think about that little table by the kitchen door, and I feel something I never expected to feel about that humiliating night. I feel grateful. Because sitting there alone, ignored, dismissed by the people who were supposed to love me the most, I finally understood something my grandfather had been trying to teach me my whole life. Being underestimated is not the same as being unimportant. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everything together. And sometimes the greatest revenge is not shouting or fighting or tearing someone down. Sometimes the greatest revenge is simply rising, calmly, on your own terms and proving, without ever raising your voice, exactly who you were all along.